Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Digital Deviants Tour. I am so excited to be here with Adam Eli. My name is Eric Cervini, if you don't know me, and I'm also here with some incredible co-hosts. Before I begin the official introductions, I would be remiss not to acknowledge the pain that our nation is feeling amidst the loss of Black lives at the hands of our nation's law enforcement. So to the Black folks who may be watching, your lives matter. To my predominantly white followers, we must do better. I've posted a link in our Crowdcast description for those who are looking to make a difference, to our friends who identify as QTPOC. And in the meantime, please join me in a moment of silence to honor the lives of Tony McDade, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, and too many others. Thank you. This event is co-sponsored by a few amazing organizations. One of them is the Brooklyn Community Pride Center, which is the first and only LGBTQ plus community center focused on serving the city's most populous borough, located at Restoration Plaza at Bed-Stuy, with a planned expansion to a second location in Crown Heights by the beginning of 2021. They provide a number of programs and services that especially serve the Black and Brown communities in which they're located. During the COVID pandemic, they've moved all programs online, and you can learn more about them at lgbtbrooklyn.org or by following them on social media under @LGBTBrooklyn. So thank you to them for their amazing work and for co-sponsoring us today. Next, we have Bo Mendez from the Brooklyn Historical Society. Bo, thank you so much for joining us, and I'd love to hear a little bit about what y'all do.
Of course, it's my pleasure to be here, an honor to play a small part in helping bring this program together, although I really do have to give credit where credit's due to Dr. Cervini and to Adam and the team for bringing this all together. I'm just here to lend my support. My name is Bo Mendez, as he mentioned. I'm the manager of programs and digital communications at Brooklyn Historical Society. We are a 157-year-old institution that is normally based out of two historic buildings, one in Brooklyn Heights and one down in Dumbo. But like so many other institutions right now, we're based out of our own homes in apartments and houses throughout the 5 boroughs and elsewhere. I am just very excited to be part of bringing this story to an audience at a moment when we are very much reminded of the fact that marginalized and oppressed groups throughout our nation's history have never been given or granted their basic human rights. They've demanded them, and they've worked to erode the systems of oppression that have kept those rights from them. So I just want to acknowledge all of the groups that have done that, especially the movements for Black lives that are happening I would say right now, but really it's been throughout the course of the entire nation's history. Like many institutions, we've had to move our programming online. So we are happily offering visual programs like this one. We've also had the pleasure of hosting programs that explore things as granular as local Brooklyn history, exploring the history of Barren Island, which used to be the city's landfill, and things that are even, meta topics like the history of history. We hosted a great conversation between Heather Cox Richardson and Joanne Freeman about how history is made, the politics of language, who gets to be the narrator of history, and how that impacts our daily lives. We have a lot of programs that are coming up, and we're trying to continue bringing these offerings online to help people engage with their history from home. Next week, we'll be talking about the history of tiki drinks. We'll also be looking at how young Black men are unjustly prosecuted via the lyrics of hip hop music that they create or identify with. When we observe the book Rap on Trial, that'll be on the 16th. You can visit brooklynhistory.org for more information about our upcoming programs. And if you're listening from Brooklyn, I just want to let y'all know that we are leading a collection initiative to document this moment in history. We are living through a historical moment right now. So if you are taking photos, taking videos, keeping journals, creating artwork, making masks, anything that shows how the COVID-19 pandemic has impacted your daily life, your work life, your religious observances, anything. We are interested in collecting that and helping you be a part of telling this story. This story is your story. This story is our story. And with that, I just want to say I'm happy to be here, and I'm very excited to hear this conversation.
Thank you so much. And next up, from my favorite bookstore, I can't be too biased because I've been warned by my publisher I have to to equally promote all bookstores, but I will say of the physical locations on Earth, the Strand is one of my favorite of all time. So Sabir, can you tell us a little bit about the Strand and what y'all are doing now in the middle of a time when reading up is really important?
Yeah, well, first off, thank you. We're giant fans as well. So for a little bit of history, the Strand was founded in 1927 by the Bass family over on 4th Avenue's 3rd Row. Stretching from Union Square to Astor Place, Book Row gradually dwindled until after 93 years, the Strand is the sole survivor. We've, like everyone else, I think, had to make the pivot over to virtual events and selling things online. And we're just happy that we have the continued support of authors like Dr. Cervini, Adam, and our book-loving community. And so on that note, I'm just going to reintroduce Adam and Dr. Cervini. So, we're here to launch Dr. Cervini's new book, The Deviant's War, The Homosexual versus the United States of America. He is an award-winning historian of LGBTQ+ politics and culture. He graduated summa cum laude from Harvard College and received his PhD in history from the University of Cambridge, where he was a Gates Scholar. Joining him in conversation is Adam Eli. Adam is a community organizer and writer in New York City. He is the founder of Voices For, a nonviolent, direct action activist group dedicated to advancing global queer liberation, and was included in Outs Magazine's 100 Most Influential Queer People of 2018. He believes that when you mess with one queer, you mess with us all, which is a sentiment I echo. So without further ado, please welcome Dr. Cervini and Adam.
Thank you so much, Bo and Sabir. Adam, hi. I think you're muted. Oh, I just
better.
There we go.
Better? Okay.
That's what I love about events like this is there's just no getting around. It all puts everyone on the same level of technical incompetence. It's just like the most egalitarian thing.
I'm happy to be here with you, Dr.
Oh God, see, I turn red anytime I hear my name. So I warn everyone up front that considering that all the events we're doing on this tour are digital and open to everyone, and also considering the moment that we're living in right now, I want to make this book tour a little bit unconventional in that if you want to read our books, you know where to get them. You know who to support, the Strand and other independent bookstores. I want to make this a conversation about how we as queer white guys can do better. And also what our own works might reflect on that. And so I know we talked about you potentially reading a bit from your book. Are you still down?
I'm still down, but do you go first?
What's that?
Are you going to read?
You go ahead.
Are you going to read your... You shouldn't go first because I feel like it's like your event.
But you're the special guest.
Okay. So this is my book, Striking Resemblance, See the Jewish Star. And so I was thinking that, well, first of all, I want to say that I'm really glad to be here and I'm really grateful to be here. Eric, thank you for having me. I'm so impressed with your organization level. My book comes out tomorrow also, and I did not do this. And that I just came back from Stonewall, where we had a huge rally to honor all of the queer and trans, Black, and people of color whose lives have been taken because of police violence. And I know that we probably have people from all over the place. So just to let you know, in New York, I live in Greenwich Village, like maybe like 10 blocks away from Stonewall, and things are very, very, very intense. I live on 9th and University, so like right above Washington Square Park. And every night I can smell the fires, and it's hours and hours of helicopters and sirens, and you don't know if the sirens are going to the hospital or to the protesters, and screams and chants. And it's just such a unique and intense moment. And I want to take that and I want to talk about the role. What I want to talk about here tonight is the role that queer people, that the role that queer community plays in its own history, and how that history is often not written fairly and not lived fairly. So I'm going to read quickly the prologue, and then I lay out 10 suggestions for how I want the queer community to change, and I will read 2 of them. They're pretty short. This book, unlike Eric's, is meant for it's YA, which I think is chic, and it can be for from anywhere from 12 to 24. So I'm going to start with the prologue. Okay. On October 27th, 2018, a gunman burst into a Pittsburgh synagogue and killed 11 people. Within hours, the global Jewish community mobilized into action. Jews across the world raised money to cover funeral costs. Rallies and memorials were held in every major city. The global Jewish community expressed public sympathy and outrage, while volunteers flocked to Pittsburgh to serve the community hot meals and attend funerals. The message was clear: an attack on one Jew is an attack on all of us. In general, the global queer community does not respond like this in times of crisis. On January 14th, 2019, just 2.5 months after the synagogue shootings, news broke that a new wave of queer purges were taking place in Chechnya, a small Russian republic. 40 queer people were detained and 2 were killed, but there was no effective global call to action. Between October 27th and January 14th, at least 3 Black trans were murdered in the United States. As usual, the epidemic of violence against Black trans women did not prompt any type of unified or helpful communal outrage. As a queer Jew, I watched these attacks on my 2 communities unfold parallel to each other. Distraught, I thought of a quote from the Talmud, a piece of ancient Jewish scripture that says, "All Jewish people are responsible for one another." We don't always get it right, but the importance of showing up for other Jews has been carved into the DNA of what it means to be Jewish. It is my dream that queer people develop the same ideology, what I like to call the global queer conscience. The global queer conscience is an attitude that repositions how we see ourselves as queer people and how we fit into the world. I cannot and will not speak for the community at large. No one person can. But I believe that this dream will become a reality if we come to this one simple understanding: queer people anywhere are responsible for queer people everywhere. And so that's the prologue. And then I offered 10 suggestions, and I'm going to read one of them. Okay, so I can't decide which one to read. What?
Read a couple.
Okay, it's like 3 pages. Okay, so 4, recognize. So these are the suggestions that I suggest for people to, in order for us to realize that dream of queer people showing up for each other. And so the 4th suggestion is recognize that the playing field is not equal. All queer people are created equal, but the world does not treat us that way. Certain identities, queer or not, come with certain privileges. People of color, the trans community, the gender nonconforming people, and disabled people, or any combination of these, face challenges that their white, cisgender, and traditionally able counterparts do not. This lesson is often learned the hard way, through personal experience. My first cousin Madison is trans, and in addition to sharing a last name and a brilliant grandmother, we have a lot in common. We are both white and Jewish and grew up in liberal cities. We both came out during our freshman years of college. We share interests, friends, and sometimes even clothes. But despite our similarities, our experiences of being queer are very, very different. As a transgender woman, Madison faces challenges that I simply do not as a cis gay man. I can shed my queerness and present as straight, as long as I don't talk too much. Madison did not have that privilege early in her transition. Before she passed as a cis woman, she was often harassed on the street. To this day, if Madison and I are attacked for being queer, the chances of Madison's attack ending in murder are much, much higher. This is only one example. As a cis man, I have easier access to employment, healthcare, housing, physical safety, sexual partners, and resources than most trans women. This is particularly true for Black trans women, who are significantly more likely to be victims of fatal hate crimes than white trans folk. The first step is looking inward and recognizing our own privilege. I found that this is when things start to go awry. Usually, people have two reactions when they realize their own privilege. The first reaction is denial, and the second is guilt, both of which are ultimately a waste of time. And then I give a little anecdote, which I'm going to skip because it's more for like younger people. And then so 5 is the more privileged members of our society must rally behind the less privileged. Once we recognize our privilege, the next question must be, how do we leverage our privilege and our resources for the benefit of all members of the community, specifically the most vulnerable? How do we break down the systems that granted us these unearned privileges to begin with? Historically, within the queer community, the opposite has happened. Marginalized groups have tended to rally behind the more privileged. Stonewall, the event which many say helped launch the gay liberation movement, was started and primarily fought by queer people of color, street hustling, effeminate gay youth, trans women, butch lesbians, and gender nonconforming and homeless folks. However, once the fires of the riot had gone out, it was gay men benefiting from male privilege who took control of the movement throughout the 1970s. By the mid-80s, the gay male community was immobilized by the AIDS crisis, but huge numbers of women showed up to help. Women, queer and not, played a key role in the success of ACT UP, the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, the activist group that emerged in 1987 to fight the AIDS crisis. Thinking of Larry Kramer, quick shout out. At the height of the crisis, HIV-positive gay men were in desperate need of blood transfusions, but all gay men were barred from donating. So a group of lesbians in San Diego banded together and created a group called the Blood Sisters. Starting in 1983, they organized regular blood drives and set up systems so folks could apply for the type of blood they need. Our community's circumstances may have changed, but the urgency for direct action remains the same. It is imperative that we pool our resources and strength behind queer groups that are most vulnerable today. This includes, but is not limited to, trans folks, people of color, American Indians, refugees, immigrants, asylum seekers, youth, elderly folks, intersex children, and gender nonconforming people. Those who exist at the intersections of these identities, like a trans person of color or an intersex asylum seeker, face even greater danger. For many, leaving the house is a life or death decision. A fundamental principle of Jewish law and culture is the idea of pikuach nefesh. And I bet there's some people who know what that is. The pikuach nefesh means to save a life. The concept is simple. Saving a life takes priority over all other considerations. When a human life is in jeopardy, almost every other Jewish law goes out the window. This same concept can be applied to strengthen the queer community. We must prioritize and protect our most marginalized members, those whose lives are at greater risk. The freer we are, the more responsibility we have.
Thank you. Snaps from everyone in the audience. It is a little surreal that there are 140 people watching, but we cannot see or hear any of them, so we have to clap for ourselves. And it was reminded when you were speaking that there is an ask a question function that I forgot to mention earlier.
Oh.
So if at any point you have a question that you think of, just type it in. It won't interrupt anything because we will get to it towards the latter half of the discussion. And you can also upvote other questions that you would also like to have answered. So feel free to make use of that as we continue the conversation. And so I'm going to read a little bit from my book. It's called The Deviant's War The Homosexual versus the United States of America. And even though, there's one guy on the spine, and his name is Dr. Frank Kameny, and if you don't know who he is, historians have long regarded him as at least one of the grandfathers of the gay rights movement. I think certainly one of the more undervalued of them. And I make the argument throughout the book that he is one of the people most responsible for developing what we now call pride. And by that, I mean the Declaration of homosexuality, or homosexual acts, as they would have called it at the time, being a moral good, and that claim being made openly. And so I'm going to read an excerpt discussing one of the first speeches that Frank gave in 1962. So this is 7 years before Stonewall, and one of his most significant contributions to our movement. It's something that I focused on my dissertation, is his infiltration or integration, how you look, depending on how you look at it, inside of the National Capital Area Civil Liberties Union. And one of his greatest contributions in the decade before Stonewall was persuading these straight attorneys, an organization that was formed the exact same year as the Mattachine Society of Washington, which was a homophile movement or homophile organization rather, or a pre-Stonewall gay rights organization, and the first in Washington. He was responsible for persuading the ACLU to ally with the Mattachine Society of Washington, creating the legal framework and also the foundations on an organizational level for every single lawsuit that you start to see in the latter half of the 60s and continuing well into the 70s. So this is 1962 when he is first starting to make that effort to persuade these attorneys that gay rights are a civil liberties issue. Frank Kameny arrived to the first meeting of National Capital Area Civil Liberties Union's Anti-Discrimination Committee and sat in a circle with 25 attorneys. Each attendee gave his name, address, and a special area of interest in the legal field of discrimination. Kameny explained that he was interested in discrimination against homosexuals. But for the next hour and a half, the attorneys discussed only discrimination against Black Americans. After a while, though, they reached a quandary. Other legal groups were already fighting for Black civil rights, they concluded. What more could the NCACLU contribute? Well, we have a gentleman here who is interested in discrimination against homosexuals, said the chairman. Let's discuss that. For 20 minutes, the attorneys examined the plight of the homosexual. Kameny very consciously kept quiet, supplying statistics only when it seemed necessary. Well, this is something that we clearly don't know anything about, concluded the chairman, before turning to Kameny. Will you talk to us about it? Kameny drafted the press release. His speech to the NCACLU would take place on the evening of December 3rd, 1962, in the second floor boardroom of the Philip Murray Building, a modern glass-covered structure in downtown Washington. The Soviet flag flew just a few feet from the boardroom's large windows, since the USSR's embassy stood immediately across the street. As Kameny entered the Philip Murray Building at 8 p.m. that night, he likely did so with the knowledge of an open secret in Washington. FBI agents were in the building too, photographing anyone who entered or exited the Russian compound only a few feet away. First, the number of homosexuals, began the gay astronomer, standing before a room of straight attorneys. He cited the Kinsey report to support his conservative and handy 10% figure. Yes, the homosexual was indeed a minority, he concluded, several times the size of the Jewish minority. The Mattachine Society of Washington was, he explained, exactly what the NAACP or CORE are for the Negro. But unlike African Americans, homosexuals had no explicit protection in the Constitution, he claimed, nothing to which they could even point. Kameny's speech was, at its core, a cry for help. He described the vast scale of America's gay purges, taking place not just in the government, but in private industry too. Virtually all homosexuals work at all times with the sword of immediate summary dismissal hanging over their heads, he explained. But there existed no greater danger than in the federal bureaucracy, where the Civil Service Commission's efforts to uncover homosexuals remind one of the Nazis hunting down Jews, in his words. Kameny admitted that he had no idea where to begin. The media had ignored his press releases and rejected his ads. The government, engaging in a, quote, vast conspiracy of official silence, had ignored his letters. While the Negro community, he argued, were experienced professionals in these matters, homosexuals in his society were but amateurs. He pleaded for assistance from both African Americans and from the ACLU. We call upon them, he concluded, and upon the ACLU, with their long experiences in these areas, to assist us in a battle which for us has just begun. As he waited for the attorney's reaction, Kameny understood the high stakes of his speech. At best, the union could become the society's sister organization, a permanent ally, and even the illegal arm of the homophile movement. At worst, his provocative claims that homosexuals actually represented a threatened minority, not to mention his references to the Holocaust, could forever alienate the ACLU's heterosexual members. Kameny knew he could not afford to lose the attorney's help. 3 weeks earlier, FBI informant Warren Scarberry had relayed alarming information to another MSW member. Civil Service Commission investigators, Scarberry claimed, had visited the member's apartment, asked about his political beliefs, and made a list of all of his books. The investigators had threatened Scarberry, claimed the FBI informant, and, he added, Kameny is in serious trouble. So that's my excerpt. So, my first question is, we both talk about our obligation to other marginalized groups. Given what you found and our history, what exactly does that obligation come from?
Well, I think that what you just read was so interesting. What year was that meeting? Sorry, I lost the year.
1962.
1962. And so you were talking about how in that moment, right, Frank had the civil rights movement and Black people in America had a lot more power and protection than queer people did, right?
That was his point.
That was his point. I'm not whether, and so if you look at that now, DeRay McKenson is an incredible Black Lives Matter activist. I think of him as sort of like one of the godfathers of using social media as a direct action organizing tool. He, sort of rose up during the Ferguson unrest in 2015, and he has this phrase where he says, like, watch whiteness work. And if you think about the incredible lengths which the gay community, I don't think anyone would say that, gay men like Frank Kameny who wore suits and, were professors have more rights than the majority of Black people in this country. I think that would be insane to say that because they're not being shot down in the streets. And so I think that is just such an extraordinary lens by which to look through it. And I think the same thing can be applied to Judaism because, once the Jewish quotas were lifted in universities, like Jewish quotas and Black quotas were lifted at similar times or sort of similar times, right? Like in the 60s generally. And if you look at the integration of Jews in like the workforce and in society, I mean, there's totally no comparison. And so I think that that's such an incredible way to use and see our history to sort of like watch whiteness work.
Mm-hmm.
I was really struck by that.
Truly. And I think on a more strategic level, what Frank was trying to do was always, in all of his speeches to straight people, to attorneys, was to build these analogies to other movements. Because until that moment, the homosexual minority was still a very foreign concept, maybe to some elements within the homophile movement, but certainly not to the general public. And so you see him searching for examples templates for how you can build a movement and build some of the rhetoric behind not just mobilizing these straight attorneys, but also mobilizing fellow homosexuals. And I think, as you mentioned, that is also his whiteness coming across, because he has the privilege to make those comparisons, right? And he has also the privilege, as many of us do, of passing, right? Of not having to carry his minority status on his skin, and so that, for me, when especially in the context of this moment, is where our obligation as a movement who has had so many tangible successes, whether it's marriage, whether it's having our own presidential candidate, now that we have made these successes based off of borrowing these tactics from other movements, now it's time to pay it forward, and to, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. And I talk about how our generation, Eric, like, we're, I think, around the same age. I'm 29, and we have a very, 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 very unique opportunity for two reasons. One is that we are a group of people that has more rights than ever before. Like, if the two of us chose to, like, you and Adam could, like, move to Hell's Kitchen or like Chelsea or any gay neighborhood and, go to brunch all your life and have gay friends and send your kids to a school where gay parents were accepted and not look out of your bubble at all whatsoever. So we have these people that have tremendous rights, but also we have the means to connect with people from all over the world. Like, we can connect with and organize with queer people in Morocco and Brazil, like, right now. And so this extraordinary ability, one, to connect, and two, that some of us have rights to leverage, is, I think, a new thing in queer history. And I believe, and I know that you agree, that we firmly have an obligation to use those tools. And when you're talking about, I love what you're talking about in terms of borrowing from movements, because we know, Angela Davis said that the queer movement would not be possible without the civil rights movement. And we know that to be true. All you have to do is look at, like, the sit-in, or like the sip-in versus, like, the sit-in.
Yeah.
And so what I try to do in my book is I try to say that I think that the relatively new queer movement, as compared to, like, ancient Jewish history, movement, can learn from the Jewish tradition of this idea that it is fundamental that we show up for each other. And I explain in the book that different queer people have different histories, and that, like, why this is hard is because Jews can often identify with each other, whereas I think it's difficult for maybe a white gay man to identify with the experience of a Black trans woman. And so the point I try to get across is that, like, anyone, where no matter your race or other identities, like, we were all born into a world that was not created for us. We were born into a world with a set of rules that, whether it's gender or sexuality, we have at some point to break. And that tie is what brings the obligation to show up for each other. And if we do that, I think all of us will be a lot happier.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think history is just so full of missed opportunities. You see it over and over again in my own book, where there were moments where we could have showed up. I think it's important, especially people have a focus on Stonewall, and I want to have some sort of conversation about this maybe later in the week. But I think, yes, it's important to remember that Stonewall was a riot, and that it was trans people of color who were starting that armed resistance. But I also think focusing on that one night actually minimizes the role that the Black freedom movement and that trans people of color had on our movement, because it wasn't just that evening. It was every single calculated tactic that our movement has adopted starting with 1961 with Frank Kameny Supreme Court brief where he declared that gay is good. What inspired him? It was the sit-ins, right? It was those students sitting there in the face of the most absurd physical attacks and dehumanization. And they proved to the world that actually morality did not lay with the white Southerner. It lay with the people who sat there peacefully. And they were able to claim that morality back for themselves. Frank Kameny saw that, and he executed the exact same tactic. He took black is beautiful, made it gay is good. Black power became gay power. Every single step of the way, we borrowed from the Black freedom movement, and now is our chance to give it back.
Could you give another example? I know that we did that, but I'm not a historian. I don't have like the examples offhand. But can you, sorry, I'm gonna switch to my list a little better. Can you, are there any other examples like that you can think of off the top of your head? Because that makes total sense.
Okay, so the reading that I gave, the speech she gave to the ACLU was December 1962. 1963, I believe it was March, is when Philip Randolph and Bayard Rustin announced the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. What do you see immediately after that announcement? An FBI file telling the Secret Service of the United States, of the White House, an FBI file, it lands on J. Edgar Hoover's desk within weeks of that announcement, that homosexuals inspired by the Black freedom movement and Bayard Rustin are planning to march immediately. They don't end up doing it for another year and a half. But Frank Kameny, where do they go in August 63 to Rustin's march? They send a delegation. There's 7 of them there. What happens, almost exactly a year later, Randy Wicker's picket in front of the Army Induction Center. Then there's the matter of their dress at these pickets.
Can you explain how that correlates? This is amazing. Can you explain how that correlates?
Yeah, okay, so it inspires them to demonstrate. You go to the March on Washington with 300,000 people there, and you realize we're fighting for our rights too. Why aren't we marching? And immediately again, after the initial efforts by Wicker failed, who's still around in Hoboken, everyone should look him up on Facebook. He's very active. After his initial efforts failed, he sees all the publicity and the benefits of this massive march that Rustin, a queer Black man, organized. He starts planning again. You start seeing the FBI files once again. And then a few months after that, that is when the first demonstration of homosexuals for gay rights begins. Every single step of the way. And then, not to mention what happened after Stonewall, right? And the importance of Sylvia Rivera. I could go on forever. I think focusing on her and whether or not she was at Stonewall, even though I think that it's important, that moment in time and who was there, I think it's a red herring. I think our real focus should be what she did for us in the GAA, the Gay Activist Alliance of New York City. She was the first person to get arrested standing on May 15th, 1970, exactly 50 years ago in Times Square, getting petitions for a city council bill for gay rights. Gay rights. STAR, Street Transvestites Action Revolutionaries, before it was Action Revolutionaries, it was for gay power. It wasn't until GAA refused to support them and refused to demonstrate with them that they became STAR.
So it just makes me so angry.
This is our chance, right? Like that, these missed opportunities, they were mistakes. This is our chance. I want to open up to questions. Sorry, go ahead.
Open up to questions, definitely. But I do want to say here and now, with all of you as witness, I am going to ask you, Eric, to make a video for me, which I'll put on my Instagram, which you explain directly how Kameny was inspired directly by the civil rights movement. Because I knew that in theory, but I did not know those examples. And I think that was fascinating. And I really and we're gonna force
Yeah, sorry for like going off too long. I was like, we're gonna make it about this special guest, and then I'm like, let me tell you.
Yeah, no, I love that. That was like,
But
that was everything that queers on Instagram need to hear today. So we'll talk about it.
I'll do it tomorrow. Yeah, I'll do it first thing tomorrow. We have Angina after this, but to first thing tomorrow, I'll make the video. I'll do a lot.
Your hair and lighting is like amazing.
Everyone can thank Adam Pell is my boyfriend. He did my makeup, so thank you for that. You can always tell I'm wearing makeup because my nose is not red, because naturally it's very red.
Okay, open up to questions. I'm just gonna pull this light over.
Yes. Okay. I'm so glad Superior there.
Hi, sorry for the dark. I will figure out how to fix it. But we have our first question, which is from John Fram, who asked, "What is one overlooked?" Hi.
That's right. John's our friend. John also has a book coming out.
I was just gonna say.
It's a queer. It takes place in Texas, and it's like supernatural queer and like super creepy. It's really good. I have it on my shelf.
Bright Lands, right? I'm so excited to read it because Texas football Friday night life was like, that was my closeted world for like 18 years. So
it's called The Bright Lands, and it's really great. And I'll connect you after.
Perfect. So John asked, what is one overlooked lesson in activism from the past that queer people should start deploying tonight?
Adam, you were the one on the ground, so you take this one.
Okay, first of all, love that I'm being called on the ground, like love that, Glam. And I think the answer there is that there are no rules. Like exactly what you said with Sylvia Rivera. Like how many rules was Sylvia Rivera breaking in order to stand in the middle of Times Square and talk about gay rights and be trans? She was ignoring the GA. She was ignoring the gays. She was ignoring the policemen. Like anytime, like as long as you're not hurting another gay person, like there are no rules. Like this idea of, does that make sense? Is that a reasonable answer? They're like, the limit of what we can do as activists is only within our own imagination. The idea of like playing within the rule box of what mainstream America thinks is like acceptable or appropriate or peaceful is nothing but a construct. And had our ancestors only done what mainstream America thought was appropriate peaceful protest, nothing would have happened. So I'm not advocating violence, I'm advocating creativity, which sometimes comes complete disregard for the rules.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's so true. And only to add to that, I think continuing the Sylvia story, one overlooked lesson that I think you get from my book, and I hope people get it when they read it, is that anytime there is an effort to exclude people within a movement for purposes of image or respectability or anything, it fails every single time. That city council bill that Sylvia was fighting for and went to jail for, the reason she left the movement was because once it finally made it to the city council, the GAA and other gay organizations agreed to strip it of trans protections. That bill still failed, and it wouldn't be passed for another decade or so. The exact same thing happened with ENDA, or the Equality Act now. Before Sylvia died, she called for the annihilation of the Human Rights Campaign, because what did they do? They stripped it, the proposed legislation from trans protections. They stripped it. What happened? Bush the second still threatened to veto it. It never passed. History will judge how we're reacting right now, just as we're judging how our ancestors and past activists reacted then. And so now is our moment to make sure that future generations of queers and activists say they did right, finally.
Okay, I love that so much. Queer history is so cool and so chic. I love that, and I want to add to that by saying very quickly that like when it comes to like TERFs or trans exclusionary radical feminists, or the idea of gay people that don't want trans people in the movement, That is like my one. I'm not a fan of cancel culture. Always terrified of being canceled, but that's my one cancelable offense is like gay people not showing up for trans rights. And it's like history has always shown that when you deny someone their truth, it doesn't work. History's always going to write it the other way, and as a gay person, you should know that.
Right. Exactly. We'll take the next one.
I feel like we did well.
Okay. So this question is from Richard in Australia, who asks, could our community have reached where we are today without the violence of Stonewall? And then I guess the extension of that question is, how do you pair language around the idea of peaceable protests, both historically and today?
I feel like that's for Eric. I feel like that's for Eric.
Okay.
Wait, can you ask the second part again? Can you ask the second part again?
Sure. So the extension, which I was sort of curious about, is particularly at this moment, we're hearing a lot of language around the idea of peaceable protests, and whether or not that aligns with the sort of historical background of protests, like the civil rights movement, like the Stonewall riots.
Mm-hmm. I think it would have happened eventually. It may not have been at the Stonewall Inn. It may not have been that exact night. It would have happened eventually when you look at the 60s and just the unrest, whether it was Detroit 67, DC 68, / all over the country, 69, it was going to happen. I think what made it especially different, because you have these other violent uprising even before Stonewall, whether it was Compton's. Anyone who hasn't seen Screaming Queens needs to go watch it tonight, period. Susan Stryker is amazing and an icon, and this was before Stonewall. What made him different? The Village Voice was at the Stonewall. The New York Times covered this Stonewall, and that signaled to activists who were already up in arms, literally, against the war, against racism, for revolution, that the homosexual minority, or that movement, the homophile movement at the time, was ripe for mobilization. So I think it still would have happened. I think it probably would have taken some sort of act of violence. You see the same thing after the 68 Chicago Convention, after that moment of police brutality, where the public saw the protesters as the ones who were the bad guys. But what happened, even though the public turned against the protesters, SDS had an extreme explosion in sizes of chapters after that moment. So even we need to remember that this moment right now that we're experiencing, this isn't for the public, right? This isn't for the swing states of whether or not we go on the streets in March. This is to, the queer kids in Arkansas who have never felt part of the gay movement because it's too white, it's too upper class. We need to send a signal that that's done.
I agree. I think from a movement perspective, I agree with Eric. And whereas the violence of Stonewall and what was, if you think about the story of Stonewall, I think that it acted, from a movement perspective, I think that it acted as a catalyst. And I think one of the reasons why was the extraordinary press, the extraordinary circumstances, the drama. Greenwich Village at that time already had all of this folklore, and there was so much going on there that the idea of it aflame with sissies was a pretty, think about where it is today. And so I definitely see it as a catalyst, right? So I would agree with that from the movement.
Totally. Uh-oh, I think you're muted.
Hi, sorry about that. So a paraphrase of a question, which is to bounce off of a term you had just used. Someone asked if you could please explain homophile and how, and I'm not sure if this is related, and how Ernestine Eckstein was one of the first Black lesbians to be out in public via the annual reminders picketing.
I love Ernestine. Yes, sorry. Frank Kameny would be very mad at me that I did not open up this entire conversation with like a few paragraphs on what homophile was. And he was very specific that it's different than homosexual, because a homosexual is your sexual orientation. Homophile, at least at the time, was the fact that you were fighting for homosexual rights. So that's where that homophile came from. So technically, you could be a straight homophile activist, whereas you can't really be a straight homosexual. That's the difference. It's a adjective. And so, second question was Ernestine. Ernestine Eckstein. Her real last name was Eppinger. First lesbian woman of color to march with the homophile picketers. Her interview with Barbara Giddings in the Ladder. I will try to post it somewhere, maybe in the comments or something. Everyone should just sit and read it, because it was like a 3-hour-long conversation that she had with Barbara Giddings, who is the editor of the lesbian publication, The Ladder. And it's just amazing to see how she balanced in 1964 these different parts of her identity, and also her role in radicalizing the New York chapter of the Daughters of Bilitis. And one of the most interesting parts is she is the only one in all of my research within the DOB, the Mattachine, any of these early pre-Stonewall organizations, who said, you know what conversation we need to be having? We need to be talking about trans rights, right? This is a Black lesbian woman in 1964 saying, you know what our movement is forgetting? Trans rights, right? Like, everyone needs to just sit down and listen to it. If you're in New York City, go after all this mess is over, go to the New York Public Library, go to the Archives Division. Anyone can go and request to hear her interview, and you can sit there and listen with your iPad and listen to her words. It'll change your life.
Wait, so I just want to say, first of all, that's amazing, and I did not know that. And like, what a freaking hero on so many, for like Black queer women, but also for lesbians that are standing up for trans women. Unfortunately, we need heroes in that category, but we do. And that is like the intersection of so many of my interests. And like, talking about like Watch Whiteness Works and queer erasure, like, I know the name of so many lovely, influential, or maybe mediocre, like gay white men that like lived in Greenwich Village and like did a bunch of stuff. And how could I not have known the name of this incredible woman? And I wrote a freaking book that's gonna be in the Strand that queer erasure, and I don't even know her. I talk about not learning Alan Turing's name, even though all we talked about was the Holocaust growing up. But like, the fact that I don't know who that woman is, I'm gonna post about her tomorrow.
Yeah,
I'm gonna make you write a post about her tomorrow.
I'll send the PDF of The Ladder. Berkeley, an institute at Berkeley, did a great job of digitizing all of the old editions of The Ladder. She's on the cover. She's one of the first. It was Lily Vincennes, and then it was Ernestine. And if you're wondering what happened, she left the movement because they weren't doing enough. They were not militant enough. They were not fighting for the most marginalized. And she went and joined the Black Freedom Movement because that's where she was pushed.
See, that's just like watch, but like the fact that I don't know who that woman is how she never come up with billions of queer history that I've consumed.
Yeah. Maybe time for one more?
Yes. And it seems like technically we've answered all of the questions which were submitted in one form or another. So it's like a sort of final question I would ask you both is what do you largely hope people take away from your books? Like at the end of the day?
Adam. I'm talking too much.
Mine is really, really simple and really, really queer. I mean, it is really queer, but really, really clear and really, really simple, which is that if you are queer, that means that you are a part of something greater than yourself. That means that you are not alone. It means that you have people to look after you and people that you should be looking after. And that whole concept can be summed up in the idea that queer people anywhere are responsible for queer people everywhere, and that only starts when you decide to do it. So you are a part of something greater than yourself, and that comes with huge gifts and huge obligations. That's
we have very similar themes in our books, and I think one of the characters who's one of my favorites, he went to University of Texas at Austin, which is my hometown. He organized the first homophile picket in the country, is Randy Wicker. And I got to spend a couple weekends with him, learning his story, going through his papers, hanging out with him in Hoboken. And he's 81 years old. Last year, instead of going to the Pride Parade, he went to the Resistance March, wearing buttons of Marsha P. Johnson, who he lived with. And they were best of friends, and buttons that said, Sylvia, that said trans rights. He is the first to admit that he was, in the 60s, a male chauvinist pig, and he has dedicated the rest of his life after Marsha's murder and after Sylvia's death. He has made it his mission for the rest of his life to make up for all the mistakes that he and his fellow homophile activists made, and to fight for our trans and brothers and sisters and people, our Black brothers and sisters and everything in between who are suffering right now. I think it's our opportunity right now as white cis dudes to say, all right, let's make it right. That's all I got.
Eric, thank you so much.
Thank you. And
I mean, how great queer history is. I can't wait to commission a bunch of stuff from you tomorrow for my Instagram.
Please. And also, there's links to support the Strand.
Sorry.
And support, buy a book, but also, like, it doesn't have to be our books. There are so many amazing books that we can all learn from right now. And it's just such an honor to be in conversation with you, Adam, and also supporting independent bookshops and queer voices all over the world. So thank you so much.
I'm so glad that I could be here. I'm going to go eat frozen yogurt.
Yes, I'm so done. All right. Thank you, everyone, so much. Next up, we have Angina, who I cannot wait to talk about, and she's coming up on Drag Race All-Stars. So you're in good company, Adam.
Thrilled, overjoyed.
All right. Thanks again.
I don't know how to leave, so you're going to have to do that. I don't know how to leave, so you're going to have to.
All right. I will usher everyone off the stage. Everyone, thank you so much. Have a good night. Stay safe. Bye-bye.